He's a local psychiatrist, has been for many years, also president and founder of Key Ministry. Dr. Steve Grcevich, welcome back.
Thanks for having me back again.
I think you actually went up and asked a question, too.
Yeah, I asked that's our question.
That's
Can't remember
right.
what I asked them, but
Yeah, when you went up to ask the question, I was
Yeah.
like, ooh, I know that guy. I know that guy. It was awesome. But you're not here for that purpose. Again, if you're listening in and you are connected in some way, sensitive to eating disorders, just plan accordingly. We're going to be chatting about that for a minute. Now, Doc, if we back up, I recall in my life when I was like a preteen and teen, almost all of what teens were told about was anorexia and bulimia.
mm-hmm.
I don't hear about as much anymore, but that was a huge problem for many years, was it not?
Well, yeah, it's interesting that part of how I got interested in child psychiatry was that my last year of medical school, when I was doing electives, I was actually in Chicago, spent the summer working in an eating disorder clinic.
Oh.
And that was almost 40 years ago when there was a lot of talk about this. That was somewhere in 1985. And that there was very much a lot of talk about this, that there were specific hospitals and centers that had been opened. And talk of this then, like when we got into, the 90s, particularly like 2000s, kind of faded away.
Why is that? Do you know?
I think that there was probably a component of social contagion that was associated, like when this first came out, like, you think back to like, that time, like, Karen Carpenter had gotten a lot of press back in the day. And it was something that was openly talked about for a while. I think that one of the things we started to see happen is that a lot of times the same underlying issue may manifest itself in different ways. So that, for example, one of the things that I've observed is that a lot of the girls who would have ended up in an eating disorder unit for anorexia in the 1980s are now in gender medicine units getting the cross-sex hormone. Yeah, very, very similar, sort of profile, like that they tend to be oftentimes very, very bright, significant self-consciousness about like body image, physical appearance, somewhat perfectionistic, have a hard time being able to let stuff go. And so again, like a lot of the attributes of the girls that I would see nowadays coming through struggling with our, a lot of the gender stuff in our practice is not dissimilar to what I saw like back in the 80s when we had girls who were struggling with anorexia.
Now, one of my personal theories, too, is that I think beauty standards have shifted quite a bit from the 80s to the 2000s. When you go back and watch movies from the 1980s, like horrifyingly thin women were starring in films. It's hard to describe, and I hope I don't sound insensitive with that, but it's like you look at it and go, oh, no. But that was what the common thing was, I suppose. The strange thing I discovered, though, you sent me an article from the New York Times. Apparently, until 2013, eating disorders were so focused on women that loss of menstruation had long been considered the official symptom of anorexia.
That's right. So one of the things when they came out with the DSM-5 that changed is that they had revised the criteria. And as a result, there were more men who started getting diagnosed. And part of the study that the New York Times was referring to was that there was a study that came out where they were looking at hospitalizations for kids in Ontario, Canada, with eating disorders. And that compared to 20 years ago, the number of boys who are getting admitted is double what it was proportionally.
Double?
Well, the proportion of boys. So it was about 1 in 20 folks with identified eating disorder 20 years ago was male. It's now 1 in 10. But overall, there had been a 400% plus increase in the number of boys being hospitalized in Ontario for eating disorders from 2002 to the present date.
Now, it's fascinating to watch these gender shifts in this because, right, as I recall, when I was a kid, boys were primarily diagnosed with ADHD.
Well, they still are. It's interesting. The boys are more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than girls, but women are more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than men.
And correct me if I'm wrong, some of this has to do with how the symptoms manifest themselves.
That's true.
And so is that the case as well when it comes to eating disorders? Does it look different in young men?
Well, it does. And so that one of the things that they'd observed in this study, if you follow it all the way out, that by the time they got to the end of the study, the majority of the kids who were being hospitalized for eating disorders did not have an anorexia diagnosis. They
Huh.
had lots of other things. And one of the terms that one of the docs who was quoted in the New York Times reported or described was quote unquote bigorexia. Think
I had never
Arnold.
heard that.
That these guys who become very preoccupied again with being ripped or sculpted, who become so intensely preoccupied with developing sort of a certain musculature and body image that it becomes a significant problem for them. So that a lot of these folks have you know what they've described as sort of like, quote unquote, like other specified or unspecified eating disorders. So that's one. The one that I probably see most commonly in our practice is something that's called avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, or ARVID. And this is particularly common among boys on the autism spectrum.
Huh.
And what this is that there are kids where one of the things that will actually lead the parents to take them to treatment is that they have such a restricted range of foods that they will eat, largely because of sensitivity to the whole sensory component, sort of like smell and taste with food, where where their children may be like, like with younger kids, where you get into like a failure to thrive thing, where a lot of these kids are like malnourished and significantly underweight because the only thing the parents can get them to eat might be chicken nuggets
Huh.
or mac and cheese. Um and 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 it's not uncommon, again, like for kids on the spectrum, and to a lesser degree maybe other kids with other mental health issues that are associated with sensory processing differences, to be wrestling with something like that. One of the places where this used to be an issue, but the grown-ups and the responsible people have taken some steps to put protections in place. I used to, when I was a resident at the clinic, I used to moonlight for the sports medicine department, and I was a team doc for wrestling teams.
Huh.
And, back in the day, you would see guys doing very extreme things to lose weight,
Oh, it's troubling.
where again, like, aside from the menstruation thing, they would have met criteria for anorexia back in the day. And the like Ohio State, high school athletic association has very elaborate and detailed sort of testing and categories in place now to protect kids against being pressured by their coaches to lose weight, to like wrestle in lower weight classes. So that one we've been fairly proactive about, and I think have done a good job of addressing that. But you came back and you touched on like the 2013 marker time wise. So that one thing that happened in 2013 was that they changed the criteria in the DSM. We've also
For
touched,
diagnosing eating disorders?
yeah, yeah. So the other thing that's happened in 2013 that we've touched on before is that was the year that 80% of teenagers had acquired smartphones.
Oh,
And
wow.
so, like, we've talked before about like the issues that girls have had, like related to like Instagram and physical appearance. It's the same thing for boys who get into this bodybuilding stuff. You start clicking on things, they put more stuff and they insert more images into your feed. And again, that, a lot of these kids, I think, due to the effects of social media, start comparing themselves to other people, seeing things online, and it can contribute to them, becoming intensely preoccupied with their appearance in that way. So that like the girls are trying to get smaller, the guys are trying to get bigger.
We're talking about really, I had never heard of this. but the growing problem of eating disorders among young men. There's a number of them to talk about that you've introduced to us here, but the one I think I didn't realize was a thing, but maybe saw the symptoms of it. It's being called bigorexia, reverse anorexia, or even muscle dysmorphia. So I was telling you off the air, my oldest daughter signed up for a Christian dating app. And after she looked at it for like 30 minutes, then came and talked to my wife, and I said, you wouldn't believe this. Almost every picture from a guy on this Christian dating app is in a gym, shirt off, in front of a mirror, flexing. And we were like, really? That's what their profile picture is? She goes, yes. And I think it connects directly to this. Clearly, this is a trend of you got to be ripped to be attractive.
Yeah, it sounds like these guys need to come to the Walkworthy Men's Conference in 3 weeks.
Right. They're not going to see it modeled from the stage, I'll tell you that. I have not. I tried to work out like that in middle school. I'm too lazy to stick with it. It takes a significant measure of discipline and such, but what would be a symptom of somebody who's got a problem with bulking up?
So it starts to become a problem when it starts interfering with other significant areas of your life. Like when the amount of time or your preoccupation with this starts interfering with your abilities to maintain your schoolwork, maintain your friendships, when you start experiencing physical consequences and medical problems associated with the steps that you're taking to try to have a certain build.
Like what's an example of that?
An example specifically of like a medical consequence, that for example, you're getting dehydrated and because you're not drinking enough fluid, and as a result you're starting to get into issues with significant headaches, or you get dizzy and lightheaded when you get up from a chair, or you're getting headaches, or you're experiencing symptoms during the day because you're restricting your food intake and your blood sugar levels getting too low.
Because as I understand it, with bodybuilding, it's not quite bodybuilding, but whatever this is that these young men are doing, is significant dietary restrictions.
Well, it's significant. Not only is it significant dietary restrictions, but there are a lot of and we're not talking about like steroids here. Like I've had a kid or two who came in after like ordering stuff like that from outside the country over the internet, where there was a whole nother set of problems. But like one of the things that you see a lot of times with these kids, where they're like, they're buying like these, they're into the protein shakes and they're doing, creatine and these other naturopathic kind of things. They get into these regimens where they have to remember to take these supplements maybe every hour, every 2 hours. And they may have 5 or 10 or 15 different things that they're taking throughout the day. And so one of the things we have been talking about, like during the news and during the break, is that almost all of the kids that I've ever seen who got to the point that they started entering like these bodybuilding competitions had obsessive compulsive disorder, because the extreme attention to detail and the extreme conscientiousness or excessive conscientiousness to following these very, very detailed nutritional kinds of things. It would be difficult for someone who wasn't wired that way to be able to follow through on all of the things and to be as compulsive about working out for as many hours a day as a lot of those guys do, who are, and girls as well, who are entering into those competitions.
Yeah, it's becoming much more popular, clearly, to go for that type of physique. What would cause a young man to have to be hospitalized for this type of disordered eating? Because, I mean, to be honest, it could mask itself in being like health conscious. Like I think a parent could fool themselves into going, no, my son is just worried about being health conscious.
Well, they could end up being hospitalized if some of the things that they were eating, like, one of the issues you start seeing with some of these kids who are malnourished is that they get into cardiovascular problems and issues with their heart rhythm. So that's oftentimes like the most serious thing that we would end up like seeing with like some of these kids with like anorexia, where again, if they're not eating enough of the right stuff, if they get too, if they end up being too underweight or have like too low a percentage of body fat, you know, that, you know, that ends up like creating health problems in and of itself. It's interesting, like you were talking about high school. One of my study buddies in high school actually qualified for the Olympic trials in gymnastics.
Whoa.
But he was sick for a period of time because at the time he went to West Point, he had the lowest body fat of any guy in the history of the academy.
That can't be good though, can it?
No, it wasn't. Like again, like he literally physically got sick, like because
Ugh.
like when your body fat's too low, your metabolism doesn't work the way that it's supposed to.
Well, and I think as a parent, if you're not informed on this well, you would just be like, stop that. Here, eat this, eat that. Stop doing that. But this is a serious issue that has to be addressed, right?
Well, because kids don't respond to that they're so fixated on, trying to achieve a certain physical condition or a certain physical appearance that that they are not open to accepting those kinds of suggestions from other adults in their life. That's what makes it a disorder. And when it gets to an extreme like that, that would be like one of the reasons why kids would end up in a hospital because they're starting to develop like, all of the things that you happen when you're malnourished. You start, getting into, to skin problems, cardiovascular kinds of issues. And other medical complications associated with that.
So what's your advice for parents who are listening and they are concerned? Maybe they have a son or grandson who's exhibiting at least some of these symptoms of bigorexia. What do you do?
So this would be one area where you would probably want to start with the primary care doc and look at medical stuff as opposed to necessarily like running out and like trying to find like a mental health practitioner. I mean, that there are a few specialty clinics, kind of few and far between, that will deal with some of this stuff from like a mental health standpoint. But the kinds of things that you're looking at here are physical things, so that you want to make sure that that they're not eating in such a way that they're like developing problems, like for example with like bone density, which is something that we can get into, with kids if they're not, you know if they don't have enough calcium in their diet. That, in the case of girls, oftentimes, like one of the ways that this manifests itself is through issues with menstruation. Anemia would be like another issue. And so that making sure that like your primary care doc is, monitoring their weight, monitoring their cardiovascular status, like monitoring for anemia, monitoring that they're hitting milestones on their growth charts appropriately and that they have adequate bone density. It's oftentimes when this becomes like very serious, it's the physical complications associated with malnutrition that end up being the problem. So that I would start with your child's pediatrician or primary care doc and, have them, do the things on a physical examination, order the kinds of medical tests that you need to do to monitor for this stuff. And then, if in fact they're seeing that there's a problem, they will end up pulling in the people who specialize in treating this and the people who specialize in treating the concomitant mental health stuff that oftentimes goes along with this.
Would you recommend, because of the psychological aspects of this condition, maybe privately speaking with a physician prior to an appointment or sending a note saying, I have concerns, could we do some testing? Because you may not be able to talk about it in front of the kid, right?
Well, I think that there are HIPAA issues too that involve kids, like, and once kids get above a certain age, typically like around 13 or 14, a lot of times like pediatricians will tend to want to afford them their own private time. But one of the things that I tell parents is, I encourage it in my practice, but one of the things I tell parents is that, that there may be situations where the doc won't want to respond, like particularly if you have a kid who's a young adult, but we all always value information that comes from the family. And so like if you're in a situation where, for example, that doc style of practice is that they like to spend some time with like an adolescent alone, by all means, I would give them a heads up in advance and like let them know specifically like what some of the concerns are that are, leading them, to want their kid to be seen.
Great stuff. Again, consider looking into this if you're concerned about someone in your life. Is it fair to call it a new title, bigorexia?
It's not an official title, but it's definitely a thing.
Yeah, and keep an eye on it, on the young men in your life, as it's becoming more and more of a problem. Dr. Steve Grcevich, thank you for coming in today to help talk to us about this. Again, he is president and founder of Key Ministry and a local psychiatrist. Key Ministry wants to make sure that your church cares about people with disabilities and knows how to minister to them effectively, and has wonderful resources available. If folks want more information or to go to your conference, how do they do it?
www.keyministry.org. And if anybody would like to escape the gray and gloom that has characterized Northeast Ohio over the last 2 months, Disability in Church is the largest disability ministry conference in the country, May 1st to May 4th in Orlando. And that's something that we host, and we're going to have close to 100 different speakers.
Wonderful.
And 3 days worth of content there.
Go check it out, keyministry.org. Thanks again. Appreciate it, Doc.
Thanks, guys.